Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Chris McCauley, Benefits Attorney with ProBenefits. I'm joined today by Charles Crabb, Benefits Consultant here at ProBenefits. Today's presentation is an update on Cobra requirements for group health plans. A couple of housekeeping items before we start the presentation. First, as always, everyone in attendance will receive a copy of the slides and a recording following the presentation. Second, if you're having some technical difficulties or some audio issues, try calling in using the phone number on and call in on your telephone. As always, you can use the control box on the right side of your screen to submit written questions that we will try to get to during the presentation. And then finally, our monthly client webinar series will be taking a break in July. There won't be a monthly webinar in July. I know many of you have busy summer schedules, so we'll take July off and get started again in August, so you will get an invitation for that August presentation. And in addition, after the King v. Burwell Supreme Court case, we may hold a short compliance webinar. If we do that, then you will also get an invitation for that as well. This session, here's a quick outline of what we're going to cover. First, a refresher of Cobra basics. We're also going to talk about some hot topics and current issues surrounding Cobra. And then finally, we're going to try to do our best to get to your questions and answer them during the presentation. So we have a lot of material to cover, so let's jump straight in. So when we talk about Cobra, what are we talking about? Cobra is the federal law that allows certain individuals to continue group health coverage once they lose that coverage or lose eligibility for that coverage through their employer. So Cobra is a very complex law. We could probably have a month-long course and not cover everything we need to know about Cobra. So in about 35-40 minutes here, we're just going to do our best to scrape the surface and look at the very basics. So in its simplest form, Cobra occurs when a qualified beneficiary, someone who is covered by a group health plan, loses that group health plan coverage due to a qualifying event. And if that happens, they may elect to continue that group health coverage for a limited period of time by continuing to pay for that coverage. So in its very basic, simplest form, that is what Cobra is, the continuation of group health coverage. Not everyone is eligible for Cobra, and in order for Cobra to apply, there must be a triggering event and a loss of coverage, and we'll talk about those specific points later on in the presentation. In terms of the who of Cobra, so what employers are subject to Cobra and need to comply with Cobra? Cobra applies to all employers with 20 or more employees on a typical day measured in the previous calendar year. So if you had more than 20 or more employees in 2014, you are subject to Cobra for all of 2015. And the only sort of full exceptions are for our normal ERISA exemptions, which are government plans and certain church plans. Now, just because you're a small employer doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to offer continuation coverage. You may not be subject to federal Cobra, but certain state rules may apply. So depending on what state you're in, if you're under 20 employees, you still may have to offer continuation coverage. So that's just something to be aware of. And then what individuals does Cobra apply to? So once you're an employer that has decided Cobra applies to you, what individuals might need to be offered Cobra coverage? And that is all qualified beneficiaries who have been covered under a group health plan and lost coverage. So that could potentially be the covered employee. It also could be covered spouses and dependents. So each of those different individuals has their own independent right to elect Cobra. So those are that's the who of Cobra. Now let's move into the what. So what plans does Cobra apply to? Obviously, you don't have to offer continuation coverage for all of the benefits that you offer. Cobra applies only to group health plans that are sponsored by employers. So here's a list of some of the plans that Cobra applies to. Obviously, at the top we have our most obvious. Health insurance plans, vision plans, dental plans. Obviously, those are group health plans for Cobra purposes. Some of the plans that are often overlooked or missed are health FSAs and HRAs. Those two types of plans are without a doubt subject to Cobra. They are group health plans that should be offered to qualified beneficiaries, so continuation coverage should be offered. So those are the obvious examples that are absolutely group health plans. We also have some other plans that are sort of in a gray area, potentially EAPs, employee assistance programs, wellness programs, and on-site clinics. And we have a slide later that we're going to talk about these particular benefits, but just know that these are potentially Cobra benefits, so you may need to offer Cobra to for these benefits. Finally, you can see a list of what plans Cobra does not apply to: disability plans, HSA bank accounts, life and AD&D plans, and indemnity plans. So what we need to pay attention to is whether there is a group health plan. So those are the plans that Cobra applies to. Here's a very, very basic timeline of Cobra in terms of how Cobra administration works throughout the whole process. So Cobra administration initially starts when an employee becomes covered by group health coverage. So at that point, Cobra begins to apply for that particular employee or his covered spouse and dependents. So upon enrollment in the group health coverage, the employer is first required to provide an initial notice, and that needs to be provided within 90 days after coverage begins. Once the initial notice is provided, there really isn't much Cobra administration and for that particular employee until there is a Cobra qualifying event, and that, which we're going to talk about in an upcoming slide. The qualifying event is when the employee, the spouse, or the dependents lose coverage under the plan. So if there's a qualifying event, Cobra needs to be offered to the potential beneficiaries. Then a Cobra election notice needs to be provided by the employer to the potential beneficiaries. And that a notice could be provided up to 44 days after the qualifying event. However, that election notice really should be provided as soon as possible after the qualifying event. Delaying the election notice only delays the amount of time that the individual can elect to Cobra continuation coverage, which could cause some administration headaches. So the election notice upon a qualifying event should be provided as soon as possible after that qualifying event occurs. Once the beneficiary receives the election notice, he or she has 60 days to make a Cobra decision, so whether to elect to continue coverage or not continue coverage. So that's a long period of time that they have to elect coverage, 60 days. If the beneficiaries do decide to elect Cobra, they have an additional 45 days after they make the election to make their initial Cobra premium payment. And we're going to talk about that in a future slide, but after the election, an additional 45 days to make the initial Cobra premium payment. Then once they elect coverage, once they pay for coverage, Cobra coverage continue for a maximum coverage period, depending on the qualifying event that is involved, either 18 or 36 months. Under certain circumstances, coverage can be terminated sooner. For example, if the beneficiary doesn't pay their premium payment, then coverage can be terminated. But generally, the maximum coverage period is going to be 18 or 36 months, depending on the qualifying event. And then once Cobra coverage does terminate, a notice of Cobra termination should be sent as soon as to let the beneficiaries know that their coverage is terminating and they're going to need to get coverage elsewhere. Here's a list of the triggering events that can lead to Cobra needing to be offered. So in the absence of any of these triggering events, Cobra would not need to be offered. So let's start basically at the bottom of the slide, which is to say that Cobra only needs to be offered if one of these events occurs and it causes a loss of coverage under the plan. So these are the triggers to trigger the requirement of Cobra being offered to beneficiaries. By far the most common are probably 1 and 3, termination of employment. So upon termination, an employee will lose eligibility, obviously, under the employer's plan, so they lose coverage. So potentially they should be offered Cobra. And ceasing to be a dependent aging off of the plan is probably the second most common triggering event. I think the two here, number 4 and 5, divorce or legal separation, and then Medicare. We talked about only scraping the very basic surface of Cobra today. These are complex triggering events. There are certain nuances involved. Lots of times the timing of the triggering event can have an impact on whether Cobra needs to apply and how long is the maximum coverage period. And so it's just something to know that we wanted to list the triggering events, but just be aware that these are complex issues and there are certain nuances that are involved. The next thing I wanted to put up is the Cobra Notices. So if you are an employer subject to Cobra and you need to offer Cobra, or Cobra has been continued by a beneficiary, you are required to provide the beneficiaries with certain notices that provide them with more information about their coverage and about Cobra continuation coverage. So by far the two most common and two most important are the initial notice and the election notice. And the DOL does have a model initial and election notice on their website. So if you do a internet search of DOL and Cobra and look for the initial and election notices, you can find a model notice there if that is helpful. You can see some, I'm not going to go through all the required notices, but another important one to point out is a change in the Cobra premium. So once a year, the Cobra premium at open enrollment can be adjusted if there has been a change in the plan. If the Cobra premium is increased or changes in any way, that change should be communicated to the qualified beneficiary. So those are the required notices. We also included some optional notices. Even though they are considered optional, many of these are recommended. They just tend to provide some more information to qualified beneficiaries, which allows for smoother and more efficient administration of Cobra. So even though it might cost a little bit of money to send the notice, it might cost a little bit of time to send the notice, in the long run, a lot of these recommended notices are good to send.
Chris, would you say a word about open enrollment responsibilities for an employer?
Yeah, for open enrollment responsibilities for an employer are basically the same as their responsibilities for covered employees. So you should be providing the same information that you're providing to employees to qualified beneficiaries during open enrollment, giving those beneficiaries the same opportunities as are given to active employees to adjust coverage or cover a dependent. The same options that are available to employees should be available to qualified beneficiaries, and in any new updated SPDs or other plan information that you're providing to active employees should also be provided to qualified beneficiaries. Let's talk briefly about the premium basics. So Beneficiaries are responsible for paying the applicable premiums. Just because you are required to offer continuation coverage for a group health plan, let's say for active employees you pay 75% of the premiums. Well, if the beneficiary elects Cobra, the beneficiary is still responsible for paying 100% of the premiums, even if you contribute for active employees. So that is one difference between qualified Cobra beneficiaries and active employees. The beneficiaries are responsible for the full premium, and they're responsible for paying for that coverage on time. Let's talk about premium deadlines. Once elected, Cobra coverage is retroactive to the loss of coverage. So as we talked about, the Cobra election could come 60 days after the qualifying event. Well, if the Cobra coverage is elected, then coverage is retroactive back to the loss of coverage date. So we have a gap here when there was no coverage, but coverage will be retroactively implemented, but the premium needs to be paid for that portion. So the first premium payment is due within 45 days after Cobra is elected. So within 45 days of electing Cobra coverage, the qualified beneficiary needs to make the premium payments for all of those months in arrears, so back to the qualifying event date. So that is the initial Cobra premium payment. Once that initial payment is made, all other premiums are due monthly, and they're due on the first of each month for that coverage. There is a very large caveat, and that is there's a 30-day grace period for any month of coverage. So even though a premium may be due for June on June 1st, just because the beneficiary has not paid by June 1st doesn't mean that the employer can cancel coverage. The employer has to wait an additional 30 days. During that 30 days, the qualified beneficiary can make the monthly payment, and if they do so within that 30-day grace period, then coverage needs to continue for June. Once that 30 days has expired and payment hasn't been provided, then at that point, coverage can be terminated for failure to pay a premium. And so oftentimes employers want to know if they, once the grace period ends, whether they can extend the premium deadline or if they want to allow to make the beneficiary the opportunity to make it up. And while that's always possible, it's generally not recommended. The employer does not have to give once the grace period has ended, the employer does not have to give the beneficiary the opportunity to make it up. So generally at that point, coverage would terminate. It's generally a best practice to enforce these deadlines for consistency and administration purposes. The employer wants to avoid setting a precedent for both this particular beneficiary and future beneficiaries that those deadlines can be extended. I want to talk about a couple hot topics and current issues that are going on or common questions that we receive surrounding Cobra. The first is Medicare coverage, and we talked about Medicare coverage was listed as one of the triggering events on our list of qualifying events. However, this is a very complex issue, and even though it is technically considered a potential triggering event, oftentimes enrollment in Medicare is not a qualifying event. Enrollment for Medicare is never a qualifying event for the employee, and it is usually not a qualifying event for dependents. And the reason for that is, as we talked about, in order to be a qualifying event, there must be a triggering event, and there also must be a loss of coverage as a result of that event. Most group health plans are designed so that Medicare does not cause a loss of coverage under the plan, and that's for purposes of, generally for purposes of the Medicare secondary payer rules, which generally prohibit an employer plan from kicking an employee off of the plan when they enroll in Medicare. So I think there's a lot surrounding this issue. The most common question and where this happens the most is an employee that enrolls in Medicare, and so they want to voluntarily drop coverage. So they drop coverage for themselves and their dependents. And the question is that a triggering event for Cobra purposes? And the answer generally is no, because they enrolled in Medicare, but that enrollment did not cause a loss of coverage. The loss of coverage was a result of the employee voluntarily dropping coverage, which is not a triggering event, and Cobra would not apply in that scenario. Again, it's a very complex issue, but we get a lot of questions on it. If Medicare comes up, there's timing issues, and so formal assistance is generally recommended when Medicare comes up in the Cobra scenario. In the interest of time, yeah, let's move on to the Cobra analysis of other benefits that we've talked about that were a gray area, EAPs, on-site clinics, and wellness programs. These plans are often neglected and forgot about when it comes to Cobra for Cobra purposes, but the question is, are they group health plans? And sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. The key is determining whether the program provides medical care or benefits. So if the plan simply promotes good health, provides some fitness brochures or educational sessions on wellness, then potentially they're not a group plan. But if they go beyond just that educational assistance and provide actual medical benefits like physicals, flu shots, nutrition or mental health counseling, then potentially they are group health plans offering medical benefits, and Cobra may need to apply. Again, this is a complex issue. There's a lot surrounding this issue, but just know that if you have one of those plans, you should consider, does Cobra apply? And just knowing that you need to consider it is a good first step. There's also some questions surrounding healthcare reform and how that affects Cobra. Healthcare hasn't really changed Cobra from a compliance perspective. There have been very few direct changes to Cobra as a result of the ACA. There are some updates that need to be done to the initial and election notices that are required. Simply some information about the marketplaces, the federal marketplace that should now be in those notices. That's really the only direct change to Cobra as a result of the ACA. There's also some questions surrounding when an individual can go and get coverage on the marketplace. Generally, when an individual loses coverage under the group health plan, the individual can now has some different options, whether to elect Cobra, whether to go to the marketplace. And the short answer is that once they lose coverage for the first time, they have the option to go to the marketplace as well. But once they elect Cobra, then the individual cannot go get a marketplace plan until marketplace open enrollment or until the maximum Cobra coverage period expires. So those are the very few small compliance considerations regarding ACA and Cobra. Really the big thing is the practical considerations, and Cobra does continue to be in effect in its current form. There haven't been really any big compliance changes, but just practically we may see some much lower Cobra participation as the marketplaces continue to grow, and there are some other options out there for employees that lose coverage. My last slide I just want to say, talk about is self-funded HRAs and Cobra. I'm not really going to go through this slide in detail, but just know that, again, HRA plans are subject to Cobra, whether they are linked to the group health plan or not linked. And this is one thing that employers don't really realize, that they can charge a premium for those HRAs and include that in the Cobra election form. So just know that there are some issues surrounding HRAs and Cobra as well. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Charles to go ahead and jump in.
Well, thank you, Chris. I'm Charles. I'm one of the benefit consultants at ProBenefits. And having listened to all that Chris shared with us already, I thought it might be relevant for me to maybe just point out or highlight why you might want to outsource Cobra administration. As Chris has pointed out, Cobra administration can be very complicated. And just to emphasize the point, today's presentation was just the Cobra basics and all of the deadlines, all the notices, what are qualified benefits that are covered by Cobra, what are the triggering qualifying events. All of those things are complicated or can be complicated, and it's a good reason for you to consider outsourcing Cobra administration instead of trying to do it in-house. It can also be very time-consuming. Imagine trying to track all of the grace periods and deadlines, the number of days that certain notices must be sent, and keeping track of all that with multiple employees can be very time-consuming. If Cobra administration is not done right, it can become very expensive. Non-compliance could reach Department of Labor will possibly fine employers up to $110 a day. So not doing or doing Cobra administration incorrectly or in a way that's not compliant can be very costly. And so that's a good reason to have it outsourced so that you have a partner to help make sure Cobra administration is done correctly. It is one of the most litigated areas of benefits. Not so much that the Department of Labor is auditing and cracking down on employers, but what often happens is terminated employees or former employees will file complaints or litigate their complaints about their former employer's Cobra administration. So it's just one of the most litigated areas in benefits. So again, another good reason to have a partner to have this outsourced. And also can provide a buffer between former employees and their employer, which can be a nice benefit to the employer. So some reasons maybe why you should consider ProBenefits. Obviously, I'd like to take a few moments to mention that. At ProBenefits, we have what we consider a unique client service model. It's very simple, web-based, and efficient. We give our clients a single point of contact with an assigned administrator. So instead of calling a customer service bank and talking to a different person every time you call and having to give your name and employer client number every time, you have a single point of contact who is familiar with your particular Cobra issues and Cobra administration issues, and they'll remember who you are and remember the history of what it is that you may be calling them about or emailing them about. So we think that works very well, and we've had great success with that with our client service model. We have great compliance support at ProBenefits. We have skilled and knowledgeable administrators, and we have in-house benefits attorneys. And Chris, who was our presenter this morning at the beginning, is one of those knowledgeable benefits attorneys. We have multiple attorneys on staff to support our administrators and to give any legal counsel or advice to our clients. The software system that we use for Cobra administration includes an automated mail processing system, and this tracks and provides proof of the content delivery of all the Cobra notices and all the Cobra administration. So if your administration was ever questioned or litigated, you've got tangible proof of the administration and the dates and delivery of all those Cobra notices, and all of the Cobra administration activities are tracked and processed with that automated mail processing system. So how much does it cost if you outsource? A lot of folks, the reason they're hesitant to outsource is cost. There are a lot of free services provided by carriers, insurance carriers, particularly group medical insurance carriers. They'll oftentimes provide Cobra administration for free, but most of the time that only includes their product. So as Chris pointed out earlier in the presentation, Cobra is required for more than just your group medical insurance plan. It's required for dental, vision, and several other group benefits. So, who's doing the Cobra administration for all of your Cobra eligible benefits? Oftentimes the free carrier product is just for that particular product, just for the medical insurance. Again, with a carrier product, do you have a single point of contact? Who do you call for questions, follow up to make sure the administration is being done correctly? Oftentimes with carrier service, you may be talking to multiple people on various different occasions. So the single point of contact, we think, is a good reason to possibly outsource to a full-service Cobra administrator. It's going to take care of all your Cobra-eligible benefits. There are two basic pricing models in the marketplace. If you do some shopping and you get quotes, you'll notice that some Cobra administrators offer a pay per event or per service or per notice sent. I think one of the drawbacks to that particular pricing model is you really don't know how many events you're going to have during a calendar year, so that's difficult to budget and know exactly what the cost is going to be. Another pricing model is the pay per employee per month. That's a fixed cost, something you can budget, something that you will know what the cost will be. So we believe at ProBenefits that it's best to pay per employee per month and have a single administrator who handles all of your Cobra benefits and Cobra administration needs. So Chris, I'll throw it back to you sort of to wrap things up for us. And I will say that we appreciate your time and attendance, and hopefully this webinar has been very helpful for those that have attended today.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, I just wanted to say one more thing in terms of Cobra compliance and in terms of ProBenefits, and that's really that I think most of you that are generally on our webinars regularly know that we try to take the fear out of compliance, especially when it comes to ERISA, when it comes to Section 125. We try to stick to the basics and let you know as employers and advisors that some of the things you may be hearing out there in the industry in terms of compliance, in terms of how scary it is, that's not really necessarily the case. If we can just stick to the basics, then generally compliance is not so bad. I think Cobra may be one of the exceptions because of its complexities and also because of sort of where it comes into place in terms of the employee-employer relationship. As Charles was saying, oftentimes issues surrounding Cobra come up at a difficult time when someone is potentially losing their employment, and so issues and contentious issues can be magnified there, and so that's why I think it's important for Cobra to have a good process and to have a good support team in place for you and for administering your Cobra. Again, any of these resources that you may need, just let us know. Again, here's the DOL's website, which, as I mentioned, has a model initial notice and a model election notice, and those model notices have been updated to include the additional marketplace information that is required in those notices. So you can go to the DOL website or just email us, and we're happy to provide that, or some other summaries if needed. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap up the presentation. We do have some questions coming in. I'm going to do my best to get to a couple of those right now. And anything we don't get to while I'm on the presentation, we will certainly stay on for a few more minutes and reply written responses as well.
Chris, here's one question that's come in. You mentioned earlier that employers have open enrollment responsibilities as far as active Cobra participants that are in one or more benefits, and then they remain active and paying the premium through open enrollment. Question, could a participant elect during open enrollment a benefit that he or she had previously declined And then the second part of that, could they add a person that was not enrolled at the time they terminated employment or lost coverage? Could they add a spouse or dependent during open enrollment as well?
Yes, that is sometimes seems like a strange rule, but at open enrollment, the qualified beneficiaries, including the employee and the spouses and dependents, could potentially enroll in coverage that they have declined at some time, at some previously when they first had the opportunity to elect Cobra. So if they have elected any coverage and they continue to be a qualified beneficiary, then at open enrollment, they are essentially treated as an active employee and could potentially be offered or could elect coverage, group health plan coverage that they have declined in the past. So once they become a qualified beneficiary, they will remain a qualified beneficiary and can elect at open enrollment coverages that they have turned down previously.
Question here for Charles, if you're still there, or Chris. What do you recommend for an employer regarding an initial notice? So employer says, I'm not sure if we previously sent an initial notice. Should we send one now? What do we do if we change Cobra administrative options? What would you recommend in terms of an initial notice, and what does ProBenefits do? Charles, if you're there. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe Charles is muted, but I think if an initial notice hasn't been sent, I think to get in compliance, even if it's been after 60 days or so, that to go ahead and send those out. It's important that you do get those initial notices out and that employees have that information. And in terms of ProBenefits, if once we begin administration, we let employees know, qualified beneficiaries know that we are now the Cobra administrator and that they may be receiving some information from us as well. I see there's a question here about Cobra and health FSAs. I can elaborate on that a little bit. Health FSAs is sort of a different animal for Cobra purposes. Depending on the plan design, most health FSAs are subject to what's known as limited Cobra. And if health FSAs that are subject to limited Cobra do not need to offer the full Cobra benefits that need to be offered for other group health plans. And the first way that limited Cobra for health FSAs is different is that Cobra only needs to be offered to FSA participants that have, let me get this straight, that have underspent their health FSA accounts. So someone that has, during the plan year, has contributed more in contributions than they have received in health FSA reimbursements, that is someone that has underspent their account, and Cobra for the FSA needs to be offered to that individual. Someone that has received more in reimbursements than they have contributed during the plan year, they have overspent their account, and Cobra does not need to be offered for the health FSA for that particular employee. So that's the first way limited Cobra for the FSA is different than the other group health plans. The second way is that if Cobra did need to be offered because the employee had underspent their FSA account, Cobra only needs to be offered until the end of the plan year. So for the other group health plans, there's generally a maximum coverage period of 18 or 36 months, but under limited Cobra, coverage only needs to be offered until the end of the current plan year, and at that point, health FSA Cobra coverage can terminate.
Thanks, Chris. I believe we've gotten all the questions in writing except one, and I'll let you close with this one. And anyone who submits a written question, we will get back to you in writing here shortly. And if you open your question box, you should be able to see answers to many of the other questions as well. We did not answer them all to the group, but we did answer some of the common questions. Here's a last question for you, Chris. Due to the dates required, such as the length of time that the employer has to provide an election notice, then the length of time the employee has to elect coverage, 60 days, and then the length of time to pay for it, example, we have an employee recently that sent in the enrollment form, never sent in payment. This meant that the company ended up having to pay 2 or 3 months of the Cobra premium as the carrier refused to go back and terminate the coverage after the employer had continued it for a couple of months on its own. The carrier would not backdate it to the date of initial termination. Any advice on how an employer should handle these intermediate situations during the timeline between election notice, election, and premium payment?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's important to establish, good working relationships and communications with the carrier and with the TPA. If you have a TPA for Cobra administration, I think it's important to notify and communicate with the carriers as much as possible. Here's what's happening. This individual terminated. We are offering coverage, and this is the status of that coverage. And again, as I tried to make the point earlier that to try to get the election notice out as quickly as possible. I understand that even if you do that, there's still this lag time. The rules in terms of election and payment are very participant friendly and can sort of leave the employer on the hook as much as possible. But try to get that election notice out as quickly as possible and try to communicate as best you can with the carrier during the election period to let them know what the status is, how far back coverage terminated at the end of employment or other qualifying event, and that coverage potentially could need to be reinstated upon payment. So I think that's just the most important thing, is that communication there. And with that, I think we've answered all the questions. If not, we'll get to the rest of them in writing. But thank you for joining us. Again, our next monthly webinar will be held in August. You should receive an invitation for that. And also, after the Supreme Court case, King v. Burwell, we may potentially have a short compliance webinar. If we do so, you will also receive an invitation for that. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a good afternoon.